So Sam,
Recording.
thanks so much for being here. And this seems to be the first episode of the Beyond the Bubble podcast, videocast. And the aim is really to have very broad and intellectually curious conversations from Brussels, from a European perspective, but for whoever is interested in what we have to say, which I trust over time will grow.
Yeah, let's hope so. I think it's a really important perspective, actually, because we have something I've been thinking about around the media and how so much of what we get is either these like narrow national perspectives, because obviously we are still divided by language in Europe, or a lot of people listen to American things in English, which is good, it's valuable, it's interesting, but it is a different perspective to what we have here in Europe. And something is missing, I think, in the media scene generally, and in culture as well, to have that sort of pan-European view on things. Because I think we do have a common view on things, and it's just not explored enough, I think.
Yes, I think there is a lot of truth in that. And perhaps deep down, maybe not so consciously, but that was my motivation to explore this field. As you say, American or English-speaking perspectives are very interesting, but very different at times from a European one. Now, the kind of video podcasts or audio podcasts that exist in Brussels tend to focus on the EU only or EU policies. But the aim here is to be far broader. And we are certainly going to talk a lot of politics and general societal trends. But the aim is to explore religion and psychology and AI and technology and many other things. So with that, let's get started and tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got to be in Brussels and where you used to work, which is an interesting story.
Yeah, so I'm British originally. I've been in Brussels for the last 7 years or so. Became Belgian a couple of years ago. So
Welcome to the club.
Brexile, thank you. Yeah, good to be Belgian. I don't quite feel Belgian.
Right, we're the Belgians, right?
Yeah. Before that, I was in the Middle East for a while. I studied Arabic and Middle East history at university. Went out I traveled around as a student, spoke fairly good Arabic at the time, and then got a job based out of Dubai, where I was a sort of political consultant, helping companies operate in the Middle East, getting in and out of some of the more challenging countries to operate in. They were often oil companies operating in very remote parts of countries where it's difficult to operate. You don't have rule of law necessarily. You don't have security guarantees. So basically helping them to navigate all of that. Yemen was a big one. Iraq was, I don't think my boss liked me. I got the dangerous countries. So I had to sort of, I think other colleagues got Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, which are much easier. But so yeah, sort of running around rural Yemen, helping companies work out how to do business there. There weren't many companies that did, but certain sort of oil and minerals companies or downstream from that were trying to operate still up until, this was just over 10 years ago now. So you probably wouldn't be there today, but back in 2012, whenever it was then.
Yeah. But you were with an agency at the time, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But you also did some reporting for companies or kind of custom projects?
It was working for a consultancy, and we publish reports, and then we would get commissioned to do very specific work around a particular part of the country or a particular operation that people wanted to do.
Right.
So through that, I then moved into journalism. I worked for Reuters covering the Iran nuclear deal and for Bloomberg. And then I decided to leave the Middle East. I was about 30 and come to Europe and do something a bit calmer. But being in the Middle East really gave me my European identity, I think, rather than feeling purely British. I realized that there was so much I had in common with French, Germans, and Spanish, at least sort of Western Europe. I haven't traveled much in Eastern Europe, but I think true of that as well. We have these things that we have in common with each other, and sometimes we mistake those for universal values, and actually they're not. And if you travel in, they're perhaps a universal value for like westernized, educated people around the world. So if you go somewhere and you're only speaking English and you're only meeting westernized people, you might think those values are universal. But actually, if you spend time in the Middle East, if you spend time in India, if you spend time in China, you quickly realize that there are very, very different views of the world that people hold.
Right. Let me interrupt you here for a second. How would you define that you felt European? What did that actually mean?
I think it's a cultural sense of the role of the social contract between the individual and the state, the role of the individual in society, relations between men and women, concept of individual rights, or your relationship with family, and not to put any sort of value judgment on it. There are bits that I think are good and bits that I think are bad in every sort of broad culture in the world. But you realize, in the Middle East or in India, where I've also spent quite a lot of time, people really look after family. They look after their elders. They're in sort of multi-generational households. And that's something that we tend to miss in the West. The flip side of that is family responsibility there is a big thing. And really, you have to be thinking about your family and your extended family with all the actions you take and how you present yourself to society, which means there's a bit less capacity for individual expression. And it's a lot harder for gay people to come out, for example. In most other parts of the world, tends to be a smaller community or a more secretive community. And it's just all those things that you think are sort of universal, and you think of your nationality as your specific culture, which is all the real sort of national quirks, the TV you grew up with, what you like to eat and drink. But there's a layer between that, I think, and it could be, you could have many of them. You could have sort of Europeanness. You could also have a sense of the Anglosphere for me as well. There are things I have in common with Americans and Australians.
That reminds me when several years ago, actually it was almost 20 years ago by now, when I got to go to Japan. And that was a trip organized by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it was aimed for EU officials. Never mind. The point was that we took us on a kind of cultural touristic tour of the country. And there, wherever we bumped into foreigners, especially, say, Western foreigners, we were just so happy that someone who's, again, culturally so close to us comes our way. And be that a Czech person or Latvian or Portuguese, never mind, we just felt, we're basically the same. Right? If you zoom out enough, you find those commonalities, but it's often not easy to say what those are. But like you said, you point out on the values, on the family structures, and on so many other things that determine that aspect.
I think, we define ourselves in opposition to things. You have to see the alternative in order to realize what you're having. There's an Arabic proverb that goes, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me and my cousin against the world.
Yeah.
And it's those concentric circles of you will always have a rivalry. And in order to form an alliance, you need a bigger rival that pushes you into the alliance.
Yeah.
And it applies in geopolitics. It applies in the only way we'll ever have world peace is if there's alien contact. If we meet aliens, then we might get a one world government civilization.
Yeah.
Because
we can get there.
Our perspective will shift, right?
I was going to say we can get there easily by the alien we are just making right now called AI.
Well, yeah.
Because perhaps it might come to that. But again, that's a slightly broader thing. But yes, it's these onion peels or onion rings of commonality versus difference.
Yeah.
So you came back from the Middle East. You landed in Brussels.
Landed in Brussels, and I was then sort of very upset about Brexit because it was exactly that. I felt like I'm European, and Europeans need to stick together, sort of culturally, economically, politically. It made sense for Britain to be closely aligned to the EU, and it left. So that was a bit of a. Personally, life was pretty good. I had a great job. I enjoyed living in Brussels, but politically, that was a tough thing for me, I think. And again, just cemented the idea of sort of not just British. I do have this European identity as well.
Has it shaped your thinking about the EU or Europe or our place in the world?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, I think we have moved now to a world where it's great power politics again, and countries are forming blocs, and America is no longer necessarily an ally, or at least not an unconditional one. Russia is a very real threat. China is a very real rival. And at that point, if you're not part of a club, you risk being adrift and being pulled in all different directions by different powers. And I think Britain is, a bit at risk of that. It does, we do have the common language with America. British people are very good at talking to Americans and being persuasive to Americans. But we are not America. And the idea of the special relationship, I think, is quite a one-way thing. America has a good relationship with Britain, but not one that's noticeably better than with other American allies. And so I'm not sure where Britain goes. I mean, it's lost a lot of trade, it's lost a lot of wealth, it's lost a lot of free movement of people with Europe, and it hasn't necessarily taken advantage of the things it could have taken advantage of. There was an opportunity to deregulate massively, to have a Singapore on Thames. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's impossible to say because it hasn't been tried.
Yeah.
But it was something that could have been done that would have set us apart from Europe. But guess what? We're culturally European. We're not culturally American. We're not culturally Singapore. And so the voters don't go for it. And as soon as a government suggests, deregulation or cut taxes or cut public spending, cut the welfare state, which is the flip side of that coin, voters don't go for it. So here we are, still culturally European in Britain, with the boundaries that implies on what you can do politically. But we're not part of the club, and we're missing out on the free trade, and we no longer have a seat at the table at the European Council.
What's funny? So I'm Hungarian, as you know, and there's a famous Hungarian poet named Andras Baneth. I mean, he passed away about 100 years ago. He lived at the basically turn of the 1900s, around that period. And it was his observation, and it's a very famous, well-known term for anyone who's familiar with Hungarian culture, is that Hungary is a ferry country. Right? It's a country that ferries between East and West, right, or call it the Balkans and Western Europe, so to say. And there are periods, or there were historic periods when it was here and periods when it was there. I mean, right now, as we speak, it's basically shifting to the east, or has been shifting for over a decade.
And is there a geographic divide within Hungary, or did the whole country move?
You could even say that broadly by the Danube, so Eastern Hungary versus Western Hungary. But I don't think there's such a stark divide. It's generally the country, depending on what political forces prevail.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring it up, it's interesting that this idea came to me now as the UK, or Great Britain rather, UK is the right term, right?
It's very complicated.
Right? I always get confused because it's the United Kingdom plus Northern Ireland, right?
Yeah.
The Northern Ireland is not considered, legally speaking, is not part of the
UK. So the United Kingdom is Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
That's right.
So the UK.
Okay, but the UK is the umbrella.
To be honest, you can use them interchangeably. Just don't say England, or the Scots will get very angry.
Yeah, exactly. I know. I try not to make the mistake, and I learned it, but I was dealing with some legal text. But the point being that the UK might be a little bit like that, where there's this, I don't know if this analogy holds, but the ferry between closer to the US or closer to Europe, and at times maybe neither.
I think so,
where it's undecided where it might land.
Yeah, and I think there are two big blocks in the Western world, which is Europe and the Anglosphere, which is a very real thing, right? All the big English-speaking countries having that cultural commonality. A lot of them play the same sports, or play a lot of rugby, play cricket.
Yeah,
not the US, but
South Africa be considered part of that.
I think it can. Yeah, I mean, it's not a Western country. South Africa is a really unique place, right? Because of its history of colonization and decolonization. So. And I'm not an expert on it at all. I've never been there.
It's one of the Five Eyes countries, right? Like they call it intelligence.
Yeah, so that's like US, Australia? Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand.
That's right. Yeah.
So my point is, Britain is the only country that is a member of these two blocks, these two really important blocks in the Western world. Right. Ireland, of course, is culturally Anglo as well, and it's a much smaller country. But Ireland is also sort of perhaps now Europe's link to America, much more than, with the role that Britain used to play because it was bigger.
Yeah.
And you look around Brussels here, and there's a lot of Irish people, and they're often in very, prominent positions in media because they're native English speakers, which as a journalist, as a broadcaster, is a big advantage. So there is that cultural power that comes from being in both clubs. And Britain has sort of hamstrung itself slightly, I think, by stepping out of one of those clubs. And part of our relationship with America and our usefulness to America as Brits was being in the room in Europe when the decisions are made. and Britain no longer is. There's still still in NATO. There is still a lot of collaboration. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, turned up at President Macron's get together in Paris after the Munich Security Conference, where Donald Trump cut Ukraine loose. So, Britain as a military power, as a nuclear power, is still, somewhat in the club, but it's a more informal arrangement now. But I'm really interested in what you said about Hungary, because I think as a country with a really interesting language, which I think is not closely related to any other major.
No, I mean, it's supposed to be close to Finnish,
right?
But practically we understand nothing from Finnish. And there are a couple of very ancient words which are somewhat similar, but other than that, it's more a language family.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, it's unique to our disadvantage, because it takes a great effort to learn even our neighbor's language, which we don't speak.
But that also doesn't tie you permanently to one neighbor. Or maybe that's why Hungary does move between different. You're not part of the Slavic club. You're not part of the Germanic club.
That's an interesting thought. Indeed, I never thought about that this way, but I think yes, that's probably also a reflection of the very mixed nature and origins and history of both the language and us, if you will. Yeah. Because there's a lot of Slavic influence in the language and a lot of German influence and a lot of French influence. And so it's a hodgepodge of many of these languages with a very unique grammar structure and all the rest. So yeah, maybe that explains why the country has an identity crisis for so long, even though we're proud of our history and everything else. But in terms of our maybe cultural affiliation, there are very competing groups or competing narratives between various demographic and sociographic layers of society.
I really do think language is its destiny in a way. I mean, it's so much easier talking to someone who shares your native language. And even now, with a lot of people speaking very, very good English, you're obviously a great example of that. And around Brussels, we have a lot of people who speak very, very good English. It's the language people naturally default to. But that is sort of a self-selecting elite, and it's still easier, right, to speak in your native language than to speak in English most of the time.
But just going back to your earlier point, you experienced that firsthand in the Middle East, how language is ultimately the culture. And the culture, you said that you speak or spoke, but presumably speak Arabic.
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming the Arabic in Yemen is very different from the Arabic from Morocco. Certainly in terms of the accents and verb, let's say the word choice, but also culturally. Yes. Because of the cultural references and those points. Like I could easily crack a couple of Monty Python jokes and you'll immediately get it.
Yeah.
Assuming.
I do.
Given those references, right? Like anyways, we'll probably come to that. But point is that it's the culture in which the language is rooted is what matters a lot. And here in Brussels, that's an issue.
Totally,
because despite speaking English, that could be a very different kind of English or different kind of culture code than the rest.
Absolutely.
How do you see that?
I mean, every language actually reflects its country's culture as well. And even if you speak it as a second language, you find yourself slipping into the culture as well as into the language, which is why I love languages and why I think learning languages, even as English becomes the world's lingua franca, which I think is happening, it's inevitable. But learning language is still valuable and interesting because you get that other layer that you just don't perceive with machine translation. And I can give you more, they're more extreme and visible examples if you look at a language like Arabic, which is far different and the culture is far different. It's basically impossible to have a conversation in Arabic without invoking God in every sentence. So everything is, are you coming tonight? It's inshallah. It's always inshallah. It's not yes, it's not no, it's inshallah if God wills it.
Right.
If somebody says, if you ask me how I am, I say alhamdulillah. I say thanks God. Thank God I'm fine. It's everywhere in the language. And if you try, and I'm an atheist, right? And I tried a while as an experiment when I was out there speaking to Arabs without invoking God, speaking Arabic without these phrases, and it's so unnatural. People look at you like you're crazy. Like, why don't you just speak normally?
Right.
And And of course, that reflects the culture of a place where religion is very present. It's very sort of intense.
Yeah.
And the language reflects the culture, and the culture reflects the language, in that by speaking these words, you are reinforcing the idea in your own head all the time that I'm okay, thanks to God.
Which also means that you're in the hands of God, which also means that you don't necessarily have a full personal autonomy over your destiny, because there are greater forces out there that determine it, which again takes us to how political systems develop around the language, the culture, and larger systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that affects, if you have, in aggregate, have many million people who all have that little nudge in the brain in one direction or the other, that does affect the politics, and that affects how decisions are made. If you think that we are agents of free will, or if you think we are part of God's plan, that will change how you approach public life, and how you'll approach all sorts of sort of social questions about, again, mentioned it earlier, but like family obligations and commitments that will feed into that as well. Another example, Arabic has 8 words for cousin.
Okay.
So you specify.
It's a bit like Eskimos have 100 words for snow.
Yeah. So in English, a cousin is any child of any uncle or aunt. It's just a cousin, right?
Okay.
Whereas in Arabic, you can be the son of the maternal uncle, the daughter of the maternal uncle, the son of the paternal aunt. It's either 8 or 16. I can't remember.
So you need to have the family tree in mind before.
You specify the gender, which branch of the family, whether it's an uncle or an aunt. And again, people there is no word for cousin. So you can't just say my cousin. You have to specify.
Right.
And so again, it reflects a society where extended family is much more important than it is in Western Europe, where we spend most of our time in nuclear families, and cousins are maybe people we see occasionally. And they're not people we speak to every day in most cases. Whereas in the Arab world, typically they are, much more people are in larger family groups that are important, and they maintain quite intense connections with, and that's reflected in the language.
So how do you think that impacts society at large? Is the way societies are organized? And can we even say Arab societies? I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of people, so it's very hard to say something that's universally true for these societies.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I haven't traveled everywhere. I haven't seen much of North Africa. I've been to just about every country in the Middle East, from Egypt eastwards.
Right. Always as a journalist?
As a journalist, or as a student, or in my consulting job.
Okay.
But I've been sort of, properly visiting, talking to locals, not sort of on holiday, as it were.
Not from resort to resort.
No, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Compound to compound.
Yeah. And some of it was compound to compound, unfortunately, in Iraq. But you talk to your drivers, and you go for meetings with ministers and things. So, you're seeing the real country, and there's a lot that they do have in common. Because again, the language is very similar. They have different dialects, but the core language is the same. It's the same religion largely. There is a sense of Arabness. People refer to themselves as Arab as well as Iraqi or Yemeni or whatever.
And you say Arab, not Muslim.
So most Arabs are Muslim, but there are some countries with significant minorities. So like Lebanon is almost half Christian.
Or take Israel with a huge Arab population. Well, they are Muslims typically. So
typically Muslims, some Christians as well, and then some sort of minorities like Druze, or there's some very sort of old religions in like in Iraq, like Yazidis
or Egyptian, the Coptic
Christians. They're Christians, and there are these sorts of Muslim spin-offs, and there are even some things that are real sort of mountain sects. But they tend to be very small, and overwhelmingly. And so, I think your typical Iraqi, who I've spoken to, for example, identifies as Iraqi and Arab and Muslim. Now, I couldn't tell you which of those identities is most important.
Or whether you take it from left to right or right to left, right?
Exactly. And I think that differs from person to person. And they're all very different aspects. There's no contradiction between being Arab and Iraqi and Muslim, for example.
Yeah.
But there are differences from country to country, certainly, and in language as well. So like Lebanese Arabic has some influences from like Phoenician, right, from the pre-Arab language. before it's been Arab for a long time, Lebanon, 1,000 years or so, but still the language has influences from the pre-Islamic, pre-Arab Lebanon, which goes back to the Bronze Age, this great trading civilization that went on allegedly to found Carthage.
Right.
And these guys have heritage that goes back thousands and thousands of years.
So that's fascinating when you look at all these diversity and at the same time a lot of commonality.
Yeah.
And yet you said that's when you really realized you were European.
Yeah.
And so how did that contrast come by? Or you studied the Arab world in your studies and you traveled extensively and all that, but the more exposure you got, the more you realized about your own values, your own identity, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, and you realize the cultural differences that exist. And again, I think you can travel as a tourist, right? And you can be in resorts and you never quite see this. And there are English people or English-speaking people whose job it is to make you feel comfortable. So their job is absolutely to act Western, to make you feel comfortable because you're paying their salary.
Yeah.
I mean, resorts are the same the world over. Backpacker bars are the same the world over, right? The budget doesn't matter. You can be a student backpacker traveling around Asia. And okay, there's some value to that. You're independent. If you're young, maybe it's the first thing you've done really sort of independently on your own. But that whole backpacker circuit, there is a whole industry. In some cases, it's a huge chunk of a country's economy that exists purely to make Western young people feel comfortable. And so you are not really experiencing another country's culture. You get glimpses of it through this lens, through this filter. You eat the local food. You go to a backpacker bar anywhere in the world, it's the same, right? There's some glib message.
Not that I have so much experience.
Peace and love on the wall. There's a friendly local bartender who speaks fluent English. There's cold beers in the fridge. It's the national beer, so you can remember what country you're in, because otherwise you can't tell, right? There's a load of white people, and it's the same whether you're in Sri Lanka or whether you're in the Philippines or in Vietnam. The vibe is the same in the tourism, whether that's backpackers, whether that's luxury high-end resorts, whether that's cruises for pensioners, whatever it is.
Yeah,
that's not the real. You are getting a fraction of the culture of a place. Whereas if you spend extended periods of time there, you talk to locals, ideally in their own language, you start to really get a sense that they view the world in a different way to how you do. And again, I'm not going to put a value judgment on it here. I'm not going to say it's better or worse. I'm going to say it's different. And that when I speak to a French person or a German person, assuming we speak the same language, assuming we share a language, we broadly see the world in the same way. We have the same starting points. Whereas if I'm talking to a Syrian or an Iraqi, typically, unless they've been sort of Western educated, typically we're having very different start points on the world over, for example, they would tell me, like, when are you having children? When am I having children? It's always, when I was 20, 22, they were asking me, when are you going to get married and have children?
Right.
That's absolutely an obligation in the way they see the world.
Right.
Whereas for me, there was no pressure. There's not even pressure now in my 30s. I may or may not choose to have children. It's my decision. It's not anybody else's business.
Yeah.
Whereas there, they would feel perfectly entitled to ask a stranger, why don't you have children? Why aren't you married?
That's absolutely the baseline, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the basic point of a person in society, is to reproduce.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, then what are you? And they would ask me what religion I was. And I was always advised before I went out there to just say Christian. But sometimes I tried, when I felt safe, just being honest and said, I'm an atheist. And I said, what's that? I said, I don't believe in any God. I don't have a religion. And they would look at me and they'd say, but what are you? It was really a sort of...
Right. Your identity cannot exist
outside of religion.
Belief.
You have to be a part of a club, basically.
Right.
It's impossible to not... And they would say, no, you're Christian. You're a lapsed Christian, but religion is culture, is identity. It's not this thing that you can choose to believe in or not. It's kind of a tribe, It's
who
a grouping. You have to be one. Whether it's Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist, you have to be one. You can't just say, I'm going to leave that part of my life. I'm just going to opt out of religion. That's just not a...
Did you do an experiment to say I'm Hindu, I'm Jewish?
And they wouldn't believe that. And it's too dangerous to say you're Jewish, I'm afraid.
Right.
Yeah, in most of the Middle East, it was very, And I studied with some Jewish people, and they were told to say you're Christian.
Right.
I mean, outside of Dubai or whatever.
Right.
If you're in Syria or Iraq, you just can't really be openly Jewish when you're traveling around without security in these more sort of places away from the tourism path.
Even as an experiment, you wouldn't do that.
No.
I see.
Which again, is another difference, and it's a slightly darker difference that we come on to is, there is really widespread anti-Semitism. And that comes to the concerns we have in Europe now, especially since October 7th attacks on Israel. There are parts of the world where people are brought up with anti-Semitism, and it's not always necessarily their fault. Sometimes it's their education system. They are just brought up, again, with these baseline assumptions that the Jews did 9/11. I heard that so many times. And this is when 9/11 was only 10 years ago, right?
Right.
And that was just taken to be an obvious truth. That, of course, it was an inside
You
job.
don't need Jewish people for that to exist, right? I mean, that belief system to exist. You don't need to have met anyone who's actually flesh and blood.
Yeah. And it's easier if you haven't. It's much easier to demonize somebody you've never met.
Right.
It's really hard to be sort of racist in that way if you have friends or acquaintances of that race, because you're going to think, well, not him, sure,
Right.
Not his family, not his.
Like, I meet all of them except that
you.
one who's a good one, right?
At some point, you realize it's inconsistent to be racist and to also sort of have a relationship with somebody of that race, which is,
I often tell my kids when it comes to the topic of racism and trying to understand, to get their head around what is racist and what is, say, a legitimate criticism of a belief system. And I say, well, it's a little bit like computers. It's you have hardware and you have software. And software, for the most part, you can change it.
Yeah.
Sometimes very hard, and sometimes it takes a great adventure, so to say, for you to revise your beliefs. But those are beliefs, so that can be replaced. Obviously, hardware, the way we're born, you cannot change that. So anything that you might criticize or have prejudice against a person's hardware is utterly and completely unacceptable.
Yes.
Whereas the software part, you can criticize as much as you like, belief systems. Now, the tricky part, of course, is what is considered software. Because when you say someone's religion, is that a software, or is that such an ingrained part of their identity that you need to be very intellectually honest and very morally clear as to what you call out and what are the parts that is, again, already criticizing something that is just morally not right.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing, isn't it? And we haven't got the answers, and we're still having these conversations in Europe, and it's becoming really, and there are some people for whom if you criticize anybody from any sort of minority backgrounds, that must be racist. And there's another view that says, well, they happen to believe some things that I find problematic or that may threaten Western values, and the anti-Semitism is a good one. Or a good example, sorry. The homophobia, again, is quite ingrained in many non-Western cultures, more than it is in Western cultures. And you're right, that it's a really good analogy because, hardware is just, that the skin, your color of your skin, your body shape, what gender you are, these are all things that you have no control over. Your beliefs, you absolutely do have control over, but if I can torture your analogy a little bit, what if you have an iPhone and it's all preloaded with everything and Apple makes it really difficult to use other apps?
Right as I was telling you this example, I thought about the iPhone. I'm like,
it's not easy, huh?
That's actually an even better analogy because yes, as you say, it comes preloaded with that, and it's, unless you're a super geek, you cannot really remove it and replace it with something else, or perhaps in the case of iPhone, that's technically not even possible. And yes, so
you're breaking the terms and conditions if you
exactly, and indeed, so you can upload a lot of updates to it, and you can turn off certain features in that sense, but it's still the crux of it remains. And I think, like you say, this is an utterly difficult social conundrum of what do you do with this when there are belief systems, and that can be political and religious and perhaps others, that are just so difficult to even fine tune. But you take Christianity 500 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it was full of practices, which were kind of tied into belief systems and religious teachings, but all of them they're no longer around, right? For the large part, meaning even if the operating system, to keep our analogy, the underlying operating system is broadly the same, the way it's practiced is far more compatible with values that we hold dear as modern societies.
And I think it's because the values have evolved alongside the religion, in that, as Western countries, we developed our values and the religion came along with them. And it wasn't always easy. Scientists and free thinkers were persecuted horribly by the church, Catholic Church in particular. Various different bits of Christianity were burning each other at the stake for hundreds of years. So it has not been an easy path, but it was one that evolved. The religion co-evolved with the culture and the society in a fairly closed system. I mean, you'd have merchants traveling to and from, and later you had colonialism, but there wasn't really much cultural exchange, I don't think, through most of history. Most people were confined to the country and the culture and the religion that they were born in. Whereas now you have, people are moving much more quickly, and you can have large scale migration, and you have, the Middle East culturally is very, very different from Europe, and Europe has evolved along one path and the Middle East has evolved along another path. And if you move a lot of people from the Middle East into Europe, those are people who have grown up in one culture and now they're living in a very different culture. And it's not obvious to me, or they're not necessarily going to immediately adapt and go, okay, this is fine now, I'm going to throw out everything I learned before. Nor are they necessarily going to reject the whole new culture. They might say, I like these bits of it, I like these bits of the West. Some people move precisely because of that. You get a lot of gay people from Iran moving to Europe because they're persecuted in Iran.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times they move precisely because they're running away from one element of the culture at home, or running towards some opportunity or something that they like in the West. But it's still, you have two worlds that are now colliding very suddenly in this globalized world without the time for the religion and the culture and the politics to evolve around each other and find those accommodations, I think. And that's part of the difficulty of this issue.
Yeah, I think it's as we all know, it's an extremely delicate conversation. I mean, much more than conversation, but even on a linguistic level, it's extremely delicate how you address this. Because on one side, you can very quickly be called a racist, which I'm sure you many times have been, as you were trying to decode and describe that sort of these phenomena. And on the other side, you can very easily fall into a trap of denying reality.
Yeah.
So you don't want to put your look the other way and not describe social, demographic, political, cultural trends. And on the other side, you don't want to be talking and saying things which are, again, not true because it's overgeneralization or prejudiced or bigoted.
Yeah.
And staying in that middle course requires a very careful use of the language to say, hey, let's understand what we're seeing and what's happening without going into either extreme.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to do. And I think it's more difficult because we struggle to have the conversations. So you might have this conversation among a group of close friends. There are not many people who are going to say these things online, especially in the professional context, in sort of LinkedIn, when your career is at stake. You just avoid these questions and these conversations. And the people who are having these conversations tend to be people who are very, very committed partisans on one side. You are either completely sort of shut to the idea of any kind of multiculturalism, and you just say, it's never going to work because the values are too different and they're all the same, and they, go down that rabbit path. Or you have the view that any questioning of it at all is racist and is fascist, and you need to be suppressed and shut up.
Yeah.
And it's really and I think we're seeing it in the voting as well, in that a lot of people now are moving towards these far right parties that are just openly saying these things. And if you do have a concern and no other party is addressing it at all, you might be tempted to move towards that extreme, even if you're not naturally, even if you don't agree with everything. You maybe only agree with 20% of what they say.
Yeah.
But if that's important to you for whatever reason, maybe you've personally been affected by something. Maybe there's, if you're a member of the Jewish community, or if you're gay or LGBT or whatever it is, and you've had a bad experience.
Even let's say you used to be a Muslim, but you left the religion.
Yeah.
Again, as an apostate, that also puts you broadly in that same category.
Yeah, and those people have a really interesting, and I've met a few over the years, and again, particularly Iranians, because Iranians tend to be very secular people in many cases. There was an Islamic revolution, so they have one of the most extreme, like, Islamist governments in the region.
Yeah.
But I think your average Iranian is much less pious than your average sort of Iraqi or Syrian or something, from my experience.
Yeah.
And so you get a lot of these, but they also still experience racism because they still look Muslim, as it were. They have the skin color and the complexion of people who are mostly Muslim. They have a name that's probably Muslim. So if you've got like an Iranian guy with a big like black beard, he's called Abbas, the first thought is he's probably Muslim, and he might get some racial abuse on account of that, even if he's renounced the belief. And he's actually had to work much harder to do that than anybody who never had that belief. He's actually taken a real stand about it, and he's still getting racial abuse because people think he's Muslim. So that's a really, really sort of between two worlds. And you're
worst of all worlds.
You're getting it from both ends in that sense, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. This is very, very interesting. And I honestly haven't seen a lot of conversation around this from a European perspective. And certainly there are. And there are, you take, for instance, Asita Kanko, who's a member of the European Parliament, and she's Flemish.
Yeah.
Originally, I think she's coming from, where is she from?
I'm not sure. Maybe.
Actually, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, she's of African background.
Right, of African background, but actually it doesn't matter, right? Like she's a Belgian representative who speaks about these trends and difficult topics in a very delicate and empathetic manner. So that is to say that she's rather rare in that, because it's very easy to run away from this.
Yeah.
Let's say, or the other way around. It's hard to enter into a conversation like that, because just one wrong expression of your views can very easily make you be labeled something you really don't want to be, and what you really not are, because I think a lot of people are trying to work their thoughts around it. And often there are just very strong emotions behind that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, if they start expressing these views and they get a pile-on online, it's going to drive them further towards, because they'll also get some positive feedback from the community, the more extreme community that holds those views. And so it's very easy for people to be sucked in and say, don't care about that lot, I love this lot. And if I say something extreme, and I'm talking particularly about social media, the more extreme thing I say, the more praise I get, the more retweets I get, the more followers I get.
Yeah. There's a huge amount of opportunism around it.
Yeah.
I've seen it even on LinkedIn, which is typically not the kind of platform that these sort of narratives build up. But even there, I've seen certain individuals capitalizing or manufacturing a mini outrage so that they get more visibility or more likes or more traffic to their website.
Yeah. And it works, right? So, hundreds of likes on a post that's very glib and shallow and probably deliberately misrepresenting somebody on the other side. But, it's clear, it's simple, it's not nuanced, gets a lot of likes.
Yeah.
And and on all questions, not just sort of identity politics, it's becoming that there are rewards in this economy to being extremist. And there is little to be gained by, in the world of online clout at least, to be gained by being moderate and sensible and listening to other views.
I'd say very much agree with that. I would also use the word nuanced.
Yeah.
Because it's black or white. good or bad, morally acceptable, morally unacceptable, instead of saying, okay, let's kind of take that apart and be more nuanced in our thinking and say, okay, just because, let's say, there's a cultural benefit of a certain community contributing to society with their traditions, with their cuisine, with their way of life, there could be certain aspects in their value set, in a ritual or in some part, which is very alien to the way we have constructed our laws and the way we run our societies. And that duality is often too hard to hold. Just the other day, or actually was it today? I think you published an article where...
Yeah, as we're speaking, yes.
Right, like you quoted F. Scott Fitzgerald, is that what it's
Yes,
right?
F. Scott Fitzgerald's test of intelligence is the ability to hold two conflicting thoughts in your mind and still function.
Right.
And so many people fail that now. And, you know, and with that example specifically, if somebody is a member of a sort of minority, or if they suffer any discrimination themselves, it's like they're incapable of themselves having bad aspects of their culture, or themselves being racist or being homophobic or something. It's like there's only one oppressing force in the world, and it's, colonial thought, or, this big bogeyman of sort of white supremacist, straight white male, colonial, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And that's the source of all oppression. And they oppress gays and Jews and Muslims and women and trans people. And if there's ever any tension between any of those minority groups, it's a misinformation thing. It's the far right being, setting groups against each other, whereas they should all be in this big coalition against the universal oppressor. And obviously life doesn't work like that. It's not that simple. And yes, there is all of those things exist in sort of white supremacist thoughts and among parts of the sort of white European, particularly the male side of that equation. That doesn't mean there aren't also tensions between different groups, and some of which is, it's illegal. It's against our values. For example, like homophobia is outside our values now, I would say, in Europe, right? We have agreed that, consenting adults can love and marry and sleep with whoever they want to. That's something that almost everybody agrees on. Now, if there is a community that more of whose members disagree with that statement than the population at large, I would argue that's an issue. That's a problem. And that's a specific problem. That's not just homophobia exists. That is, homophobia exists and is more pronounced in this particular community. Now, it doesn't mean that every member of that community is homophobic. And again, this is the other thing. People take your words and they could create this exaggerated, so you were saying that, all Muslims are homophobic. No, absolutely not. Maybe not even most, but we know that, various studies, homophobic attitudes are more common among this population than the population at large. And it doesn't mean either that it can't be fixed. Doesn't mean you have to, kick them out, go full AFD, return flights. Yeah. It means there's a policy problem there and you have to have a specific policy solution. So maybe you get in the mosques, you talk to the imams and you say, look, this is a problem and we want you to sort it out. You get in the Islamic schools. You target that community specifically in the same way that you target men to talk about sexual harassment. You don't target women so much because it's a problem of men. Problems exist in different parts of the community and you can address them, and you have to have a precision way of addressing it. Otherwise, the policy response is not effective.
Which I guess presupposes is how do you identify the issue and what is the evidence that you're willing to trust? Is it a survey? Is it representative? Is it trustworthy? Or is it could be other types of statistics where you say, okay, has it resulted in verbal aggression or physical aggression, or has that led to intolerant acts that have disrupted the community in one sense, right? Like there's a lot you can look at the data set and say, okay, is this a problem? And if it is, what can we do about it without going full Nazi and without going full head in the sand, right? Like it's to say, let's try to understand the predicament in which we are as a society with large differences among different nations. But it has to be a very nuanced, careful, yet real conversation. Because if you oversimplify it, you can do enormous harm. If you deny it, you can do enormous harm. Because especially if you deny it, then you give way to the extremists. And then if you let the extremists handle it, then it's probably going to be far worse than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to come back, I think, to what we said originally, it's all about conversations, right? Conversations have got to happen. You've got to also have academic freedom to actually pursue these difficult questions. And, I can't do surveys. I can tell you an impression I might have anecdotally talking to friends and what I've seen with my own eyes, but that's not scientific at all. That's colored by so many.
It's anecdotal.
Yeah, it's anecdotal. And so you need academics to do this, and they need to be able to do it sort of without fear of saying the wrong thing or being ostracized in the academic community for saying something that, again, is perceived to be racist. If they were to put out a study that found, a higher prevalence of, homophobia or anti-Semitism or a different form of racism in a particular community that wasn't straight white men, there's a certain fear to saying that, I think, in academia, and people have been cancelled for it.
Do you think it's still very prevalent to this day? Because this was very much the zeitgeist until quite recently. But do you perceive that to be changing, or
it's changing for sure? I mean, it's done in the US, I think, because Trump has come in now, and I think we're in an overcorrection in the US. They're completely gutting anything that smells like DEI. And, I think there's a case to be made that DEI maybe went too far in some cases, but at some point it's good on some level. The idea of, diversity, inclusion, these are good things. And they're now completely swinging against it. In Europe, it's harder to tell because clearly we are influenced by America. Clearly our own conversations, we were seeing now in this vote, again, we're talking the day after the German election, 20% for AfD, huge swing. And fortunately, Merz appears to have the numbers to form a two-way coalition. So CDU, CSU, and SPD, which means there's a coalition that can probably function, whereas a three-way coalition with the Greens probably wouldn't function because the last one didn't. And he can avoid bringing the AfD in and still have a functioning government. But it was close. It was a really close-run thing.
Which is a huge signal. To I don't like the word elite, but still in this case the political elite or those who are really deciding on politics, which is not to follow what the AfD stands for, but it's a very strong signal where a large part of the people want the country to be.
Answer the question. Don't answer it in the same way, but answer the question. Don't ignore it. Don't pretend that.
Well, as far as I know, but though my understanding of German politics is very, very superficial, is that AfD came from after Merkel said that there is no alternative to taking a very large number of migrants and refugees in. And then they said, well, there is an alternative, right? Hence the name. Which, again, the kind of alternative they offer, that's hugely debatable. But the idea that a society is told that take it or leave it, well, they wouldn't say leave it. You take it and there's no other option. That is probably not a strategically good message.
No, and it's been the case now for a few decades that I think it's been sort of accepted among the mainstream that multiculturalism is good, period. And there may be some difficulties, some teething troubles, but multiculturalism is a good thing. And I think there's now a significant proportion of the population that is questioning that or that is openly rejecting that and saying, no, we want a monoculture. or we want multiculturalism,
Yep.
but for it to be very severely curtailed, and actually people have to subscribe to certain values that however you define them. And the criticism of that is it's really hard to define what a European value is.
Right.
But again, from my travels abroad, I have sort of identified some, and it's the right of the individual above all. The right of the individual above the community, and the rights of society above community, and maybe don't have a country that's made
community as in pockets of community.
Yeah,
right?
as in separate religion.
Local pockets of community.
Yeah, and you get this in political language now, and in policing as well in the UK. You notice it when there's a riot in a particular area that's dominated by people of one background. The police will talk about concerns in the whatever community. And it's like this has replaced the word society. Instead of society, right, where we're all part of the same thing, we all look out for each other in a neighborly fashion, where it's multi-ethnic, it's a melting pot. And that's sort of the England I grew up in. It was a society, right? And I had friends growing up who were Jewish, who were Hindu, who were Muslim. It was a really big Indian area where I grew up. And I had many Indian friends. Most of them were Hindu. Some of them were Muslim. A lot of Jewish friends as well. A couple of people with African background. And none of it mattered. We were all just We were all North London lads. We'd all go to each other's houses, and okay, Tarek does Ramadan and Shiv does Diwali, but they're not different to me. It's cosmetic, right? It's their skin's a different color, and their family celebrates different festivals, but that's it. Shiv wasn't part of the Indian community that had different concerns to my concerns and had to be treated differently by the police, and there was none of that. And I think that's where it's getting to, and that's what the reaction is against. The idea that people are treated differently based on these arbitrary, well, not arbitrary, but based on the background and where they're from.
Yeah, that's it. And the quintessential identity politics, which really fragments.
Yeah,
I don't know which one is
fragments.
Yeah, fragments. There you go. Thanks. Always handy to have a native speaker here. So that fragments societies. Because, like you say, it's not that we have very diverse religious, ethnic, and belief systems coming together, but we all look up to the same ideal, which is a rule-based or a law-based and a value-based society that we all aspire to be there while keeping our own identity, right? And just to a large degree, the European Union started out with that idea that the united in diversity, where we all have our national and cultural and other backgrounds, but we kind of pull that together in a certain under certain ideals. But this one, this trend where it actually fragments
divided
back,
in diversity,
divided in diversity and fragments back into. That's why nationalism has always been so extremely frowned upon and so concerning to everyone who believes in European integration, because we had seen a couple of decades ago, and not that long ago, where extreme nationalism actually leads. But similarly, the identity politics and emphasizing identity over mutual values and mutual aspirations can lead, hopefully, to not such extreme outcomes, but still very conflictual situations. So it's a very delicate balance there of what are those foundational values or foundational guiding or organizing principles that a society can come together while not giving up who they are, but still creating a common community.
I think so, yeah. And it's impossible to draw the line in a sense, right? And that cultural thing, because culture and politics are related, and as religious belief often sort of straddles those two things. So again, when I was a kid, I celebrated Diwali with friends. I went to bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. I had some Eid meals with Muslim friends. None of that is at all like a threat to anyone's identity at all. But if you start getting people who are sort of following the political side of religious teachings if that then tells them to be intolerant towards gays or people of a different religion, or that, women should stay at home and shouldn't work, or should be, pressured into marrying a cousin when they're young, or, I'm stereotyping here, but there are certain pressures that come from religious tradition and religious culture, or even just other cultures of, the origin countries of where many migrants come from, that do then start to conflict with our own values. And it's really hard to say where that line is.
Yeah.
But clearly it does exist, and it's naive to say it doesn't. And again, I think the most important thing is to just acknowledge that there is a tension. That's a huge step already. If everyone just acknowledges that there's a tension and we want to work through it, we want to have a multicultural society, we want everyone to live here and to have opportunities for everybody. And that we do then benefit from the good bits of each other's cultures if we get it right. But to deny there's a tension means you're not having the conversations. And when those tensions boil over, firstly, it means they're not being addressed, which means they get worse.
Yeah.
And secondly, it means someone who has observed something, maybe directly experienced harassment or discrimination or whatever it is, and are then being told that, no, it's all in your head or you're racist, is much more vulnerable then to be radicalized and to go, oh, well, the AFD or the PVV or whoever it is, they'll listen to me, but then you're making friends with a group of people that you don't agree with at all. Maybe you don't want to get rid of all the foreigners, you don't, or let alone all the other things that they might stand for. But you've been pushed there because nobody else is acknowledging what you've experienced or acknowledging your concerns. I think that's the real issue that we're having now, and the thing that needs to change in order to build a bit of solidarity again and a bit of political cohesion in our societies.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. It's in psychology, there is a common term, gaslighting, where somebody tells you that what you're seeing is not what there is.
Yeah.
Even if you're deeply convinced that you actually have experienced or witnessed or lived through something, and I just tell you, no, you're wrong. This is not a microphone, and this is not a studio, and we are in La La Land. And that creates such a tension inside you that can very easily boil over, which can explode, and it's far worse. So it's a difficult thing, and certainly politics is not populated for the large part by by politicians who are willing to speak the truth without, again, exaggerating or hyperbole and all the rest. So if you don't get experience as a citizen, that somebody pronounces, somebody expresses what you are witnessing around you, and be that you take Brussels right now, there's a crisis with in certain districts with shooting and gangs and drug violence and what have you.
Yeah.
And some politicians just flatly deny that there is anything to see there. And it reminds me of that the Naked Gun scene when Leslie Nielsen, like all hell breaks loose behind him, and he's a policeman, says, "Oh, there's nothing to see here, move over," right? And everybody clearly sees that the city is about to explode. So denying that sort of experience is all too common. And then there's the other side, where others have a very keen political interest of really amplifying that and using social media and manipulative tools to really make it much larger than it actually is. So you are in this funhouse mirror when you no longer know, like, you're seeing stuff, but it's hard to put that in perspective and to see, is that a large problem or small problem? Because on one side, it's a non-issue. On the other side, it's the biggest problem in the world. And you are totally confused as to where you are.
Yeah. And there was a case in the UK, I think about 10 years ago now, and Elon Musk brought it up again recently. And so
the grooming gang story.
The grooming gangs, right? And it's been pretty reliably documented that there were grooming gangs of men of Pakistani backgrounds in Northern England who were going around grooming specifically white girls, like very specifically targeting white young teenagers for sexual exploitation, for rape, or, awful stuff. And the police found out about it, and they held back in their pursuit of them because they didn't want to be seen as racist. They didn't want to disrupt the community, right, that surrounded these men. And there's a scandal over it, and it died down, and now it's coming back up again as a scandal. But once you've heard that the police have sort of covered something up and the government's covered something up, the trust is gone. If the government lies to you once, it'll lie to you again. And this is how people go off on this conspiracy, COVID, go off completely off the deep end.
Yeah.
But
this is the police, so it's not just the government.
It's the establishment.
Well, but also the ones who are supposed to protect you.
Yeah.
So the bar is much higher in that sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And they completely failed in that. And I imagine that some, girls went on to be abused later because they had failed to take the action they should have taken at the appropriate time when they became aware of it.
Yeah.
And so they've completely failed in their responsibility there. But again, if the establishment is seen to be like gaslighting you, basically, there's no specific problem here. Like, there are abusive men. Sometimes men will abuse young girls. It's awful, but it's a fact of life. There's no specific problem with men from this particular community. And then when it turns out that actually there is, and again, it's not to say all men of that background are predators or we should do anything, we should discriminate against them. And I think often that's the motive, right? That people are scared of provoking a mob and an overreaction and a race war and all of this other thing. But if you cover it up enough times and eventually something gets out, then people are really angry and they won't trust you again. And that's, I think, a big part of this real anti-establishment that we're getting on the right, where people just don't believe anything that the government or the establishment says. And that's a real problem, because you need to be able, as a society, to function. Everybody needs to agree on the same broad set of facts underpinning everything.
Absolutely, absolutely so. And it reminds me in psychology, but rather just communication as a science, there is the method or approach called nonviolent communication. Yeah. And nonviolent communication, really the Marshall Rosenberg approach, where one of the key tenets of that approach is that you need to empathize, but empathize in a way that you kind of verbalize what the other person is likely feeling. And you don't do that in a patronizing way, and you don't do that in a condescending way, but you still do it in some way. And you say, well, it seems that there's a great outrage over this, and you actually say what the situation is without really watering it down and using completely meaningless cliches and stuff like that. So what I'm saying is that if you don't do that, where somebody who's really angry is very upset, and of course this is much more than simply being angry, because there were a lot of victims in this case, and those who were massively harmed in their physical bodily integrity. And if you don't somehow put that on the table, that this happened, and the trends, or let's say the recurring events have revealed the following, and people feel that their anger is not channeled in a certain way, right? Yes. Like what happens there, if an anger, societal anger, the outrage, which is not a positive term, but it's a valid feeling, right? Well, maybe not valid, but it's a real sentiment, right? It's a natural and real sentiment. And if that is not being, let's say, channeled and pronounced in a way that people feel, okay, I'm being heard, because that's at the bottom of it, where you say, I'm being heard, but the minute people feel heard, their anger is cut down by half. And the minute it's being papered over, or they are being gaslit, the anger doubles.
Yes.
Right? And that's a counterintuitive thing, because many people fear that if I actually say what there is, if I actually verbalize that I really see how upset you are, I don't need to agree with that, but I just say, okay, I hear you, I see you, that is actually going to dissipate the intensity of your anger. And it's a bit counterintuitive, because usually it comes from fear. even on a political level, that I'm afraid that if I say that, I might create a civil war. I might create societal tensions that can truly become a huge clash. And that's the opposite is true.
Yeah.
And then they often need to learn that by scandals and through the kind of events that we're seeing, let alone Elon Musk, whatever he's doing on his platforms and his own objectives with that. But as a phenomenon, I think this bears a very important lesson.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the nonviolent communication angle, but absolutely. Yeah, I agree. You've got to acknowledge, and I think verbalizing that really makes somebody feel, it makes it clear that you've understood, rather than just saying, yeah, I understand you. You repeat back to them exactly what the concern is. So it's clear that you've understood it. And whether or not you agree, at least they feel heard and seen. And I think often, again, go back in sort of online and culture wars and things, there's the opposite temptation to sort of cancel people, to suppress them and to force them offline, force them into hiding. And so I sort of recently published a piece today, in fact, as we're speaking, and I posted it. And it was, talking about exactly these things, the concerns that people have, and maybe we should think a little bit more about that. And I posted it on Blue Sky, which is sort of a very left-wing social media app. And I have been getting a lot of abuse, frankly, from people, calling me a fascist.
In the name of empathy and compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. And, my piece is very clear. It said, I do not want the AFD to get into power, but I think they're winning votes because of this. We need to stop this so they don't get into power. It was very much coming from a place of, I do not want these guys in power.
You're a Cassandra in that sense, right? You're forewarning to say, let's see why.
But people really went for it, and they said, well, how about we don't listen to these? Because they're all fascists, clearly. These 20% of Germans who voted, they're all racist, they're all fascist. And instead of listening to them, why don't we just suppress them? Someone literally said, why don't we just shame them into silence? And I just thought, well, if you shame somebody into silence, it's going to come out somewhere. You're not changing their mind. You're reinforcing them in their view, and you're sending them to a more extreme place. Or at the very least, you're stopping them from having conversations with their friends where their view might be challenged and might be softened by discourse. And you're putting them in a place where they're going to keep quiet about it and then vote AFD at the next election.
It's an awfully difficult question. And I'm very much with you on that. And at the same time, I don't know what's the right way with bad ideas. And often the answer to that is more talk and more speech and more conversations and trying to turn those bad ideas away. Probably yes. And at the same time, it's an awfully difficult question of what do you do with once the genie is out of the bottle and it gains traction for one reason or another. What is the right approach? And is it shaming by meaning putting peer pressure and social pressure that this is an unacceptable view? So that's outside the Overton window. That's outside acceptable speech. Or you try to argue against it or actually it does seep in to the conversation. And that's probably what we're going to be seeing because of politics, because it's a signal, like we said, that needs to be somehow tackled, whether you agree with it or not.
And I get the argument for sort of no platforming or for not giving airtime to people with really awful views. I don't think if somebody is a convinced racist or a convinced misogynist, I don't think there's much to be gained by talking to them, and certainly not by giving them a place on a panel show or a podcast or something. On the other hand, you have to define that quite narrowly. And I think the definition of what gets you called a fascist now and what gets you shut out of really conversations has become very broad. And it's a question exactly what we were discussing earlier are there elements of minority cultures or when we have large numbers of migrants from a place, does that cause a specific problem? Mm-hmm. If asking that question is racist, is fascist, is enough to get you shut down, shouted at, that I think is too broad. I think that you're excluding too much. I think there is a conversation to be had there that's not racist. It's just having questions about different cultures and different people's approach to things and whether there's an issue and what can be done about it.
I have two thoughts on that. One is that it has to be good faith.
Yeah.
And that good faith is so often missing because somebody is stirring up controversy because they're going to get more clicks and likes or votes or visibility or what have you. So it's very hard to prove your credentials and to say, well, I am good faith, and hopefully it comes from your integrity or your background or your work, but it has to be a good faith question. But to the degree it's ensured, it's there, it's a very important conversation to be had. That it can be your genuine concern and genuine thoughts and genuine critical view on things without being a bigot or anything else. And then the other one is, I need to ask you this. It's more of a question than a than a point. A very good friend of mine told me once that there's this expression that used to exist when print papers still existed. And you being a journalist and being a Brit, I need to ask you, what is it called? It's the green ink people or something, or red ink people, something like those crazy folks who would write letters to the editor.
Yeah.
But to be seen or to be heard, they would write in green ink or something.
Okay, yeah.
There's an expression like that, which I'm not sure which color that is. But
I'm not sure of it.
But as you were telling me, that comes to mind. Well, the craziest voices and the loudest voices who would then be filtered out by those editors and not be invited into studios and not be republished even as a letter to the editor, those would not get the airtime that they so much craved, which obviously is no longer the case. Because now you need to be a platform as such, or regulator like the European Commission with various legal acts to say, where do you draw that line? What is misinformation? What is disinformation? What is hate speech? And how do you define those? And what are the boundaries of that free expression?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with how sort of hostile online discourse is, and the possibility of being cancelled or, losing a job for expressing a certain opinion, which can happen, actually only people who are really committed to that view express it, because they've got nothing more to lose, right? They're all in on the far right, on the anti-migration, on whatever it is. But if somebody has a concern that they'd like to express and they'd like to explore, and maybe they'd like to be told they're wrong, and they're open to changing their mind. But if they're scared even to air the view because 100 people are going to come for them and call them a fascist online, they're not going to express. So they're going to keep quiet, and maybe that view will take root. Maybe they'll move past it, or maybe it'll take root and maybe it will become more extreme because they'll turn to, other alternative sources of information.
Yeah.
If you don't have moderate people having those conversations, if moderate people are scared to have those conversations, they're going to be shouted down. Perhaps they're going to face sort of social pressure or pressure in the workplace or whatever it is. You're ceding the floor to people on the extremes who have nothing to lose by definition, because they've gone all in on a view, and they probably hold quite an extreme version of that view that a lot of people probably don't agree with. And
by definition, they will lack nuance. Yes. And I think that's my greatest frustration with a lot of those conversations, where, like your example with that quote of holding to opposing views or more nuanced views, to say, well, something can be true in general, but there could be exceptions in particular, and those two can coexist, and it's not just one single package.
Yeah, absolutely. And when did he write that? 100 years ago, nearly, maybe. And we've got worse at it. So I think it's a pretty bad sign for our sort of democracy and our state of.
Well, you may as well quote Yeats, the Irish poet, about how the center doesn't hold. And I think all those trends, which were true in that particular context maybe 100 years ago, unfortunately, it's coming back. Or maybe it never went away, but perhaps there were some better periods when it was not so prevalent.
Yeah. And do you see a way through for us in Europe, a sort of a way to better political conversations and more unity, or are we in a bad state?
Honestly, I don't know. I don't know how this is going to play out, because there are just, even if organically, so to say, meaning if Europe was a laboratory where no outside forces were meddling, perhaps we could work it out. but there's so much pressure now, both from the US and the tech oligarchy, and then from Russia with propaganda and very directed or very, very direct objectives that they want to reach with that there's so much external pressure. And I don't think there is a clear realization in Europe how serious it is. Yeah. So I'm quite pessimistic whether we can pull that off. Again, both in conversation level or in political discourse, all the way to political systems and the way we cooperate as Europeans.
Yeah, it's a tough one. For me, I think it comes back to trust in the establishment. And if the establishment is sort of in line with people, we know now there are a good sort of 20 to 30% of Europeans who just don't really trust the establishment at all, then they're exceptionally vulnerable to any kind of misinformation, be it from Russia or be it just things on an algorithm pushing extreme, which may all be true, right? But it's only one half of it's the most extreme bits. It's the other side, their worst moments or whatever. Without the sort of trust in establishment, particularly media, also, politicians, police, we were discussing earlier. But if you don't have that editor who's telling you this is broadly where the center is and what the important thing is, and this happened and this happened and this happened, and overall this is the truth. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're on an algorithm, it's this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. The truth is here.
Right.
And all of these things are true. All of those things did happen. This also happened on the other side. So it doesn't even need to lie to you. It doesn't even need to be misinformation. It can just be unbalanced. And if you don't have a trusted editor, whether that's a state broadcaster or a newspaper that's broadly sort of establishment, bit to the left, bit to the right, then you're unanchored and you're so vulnerable to this information and then to polarization, right? With from other people in your society that you no longer really live in the same world and in the same set of facts.
No, it's a very well described, unfortunately. Well described the current state of affairs. And like you say, there's this cartoon I've seen a couple of times. I'm sure it passed your feed as well, where somebody's looking through a fence in a garden or something, and on the other side somebody's watering some tree or something with a hose, and the person is looking at the water falling down and says, "Well, you see, it's raining," and the other one says something like a totally different reality. And both are right, because from that small vantage point, if water is falling, so it must be raining. Whereas if you zoom out, it's a different story. And that's how we are, because with the different platforms, our attention is directed at different things based on not just the algorithm, our own personal preferences. So if you keep looking at certain news feeds or follow certain people, then your attention is not just by nature of the algorithms, but your own preference is feeding something that you want to hear or you want to focus on.
Absolutely. And it's so much easier, isn't it, to see things you already agree with, call people stupid or bigoted, rather than challenging your own views or allowing somebody else to challenge your own views. The easy option is just to retreat into your comfortable view of everything, where everything is clear. You know who the enemy is, you know who the friend is. Unfortunately, that's not a good way to reach the truth or to build a cohesive society, but it is an easy thing. And I think we all have to fight that battle and try to do a bit better in challenging our assumptions and seeking out information that, will give us a better and more nuanced view of reality.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is pretty bad on a personal level, but it's even worse if you're a policymaker or EU official or government official, for that matter, because then you are supposed to have a broader view and a broader perspective, not just that very nuanced one. Well, with those words, I think we're going to stop it here. Thank you so much. It was very, very enjoyable to talk about not just what you've seen, but your thoughts and impressions and all that. So with that, wishing you
thank you very much.
A good follow-up to writing. And those of you who are interested in your work, they can follow you on Substack, right? If you want to say a few words about that.
Yeah, Substack's my main platform. So I've been going a few months now. I write one essay every week on a Monday. The platform is called The Leopard, so theleopard.eu. The name is a reference to the book, the novel.
Enlighten me. I'm not familiar with it.
So there's a novel written about Giuseppe di Lampedusa. It's about a nobleman in in Sicily during the sort of Garibaldi campaign, the unification of Italy, that sort of time. And there's this very famous quote in which he says, in order for everything to stay the same, everything has to change. And it reminds me of Europe now. We are this aristocratic continent. We're old, we're wealthy, we have this great wealth, but we're no longer making any more money. We're falling behind. We're like this aristocrat in the crumbly old house while the sort of factory owner up the road is getting richer than us. And we want everything to stay the same. We want to live in peace and prosperity and carry on, carry on, carry on. And that's just not going to happen. There is no business as usual scenario. Everything has to change. We have to change things if we want to stay wealthy, if we want to stay relevant in the world. But currently we're not doing it. And the character in the book also really struggles to push himself into action to try to change his standing in life.
To keep the status quo.
Yeah, exactly. Just to keep as he is, keep the level of comfort he's used to for him and his children. So yeah, the leopard.eu is the Substack. I'm on all the usual social media as well.
Including Blue Sky as well.
You can come and shout at me if you want. If you disagree with anything you've heard today, come and abuse me online.
All right.
All engagement's good engagement. So.
Right. Or perhaps praise your work. Very well.
That would be nice too. Yeah. Thanks very much.
All right. Very good. Thanks very much.